Hello and welcome to our today's podcast. I'm excited to talk to an expert about a topic that's becoming increasingly important in the modern world, the impact of sustainability on power companies. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with an amazing person who is an expert in the field and is passionate about sustainability in the power sector. We're thrilled to welcome Sandra Nessing, a pioneer in sustainability. Sandra Nessing is the Vice President and Chief Sustainability Officer at American Electric Power. With vast expertise in ESG management and strategic planning, Sandra has inspired global change. She has held key roles, including past president of the Grange Insurance Audubon Center and chair of the Franklin Park Conservatory Board. Her commitment to inclusivity and collaboration drives meaningful progress towards a more sustainable and socially responsible future. Thank you very much, Sandra, for being with us here today. It's an honor to have you in our studio today, and we're looking forward to insights and so much knowledge and experience and expertise that you have gathered over these years. Thank you very much for joining us. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, thank you. I'm excited to be here. I love talking about the work that we're doing in the energy sector, particularly in the power sector. I have spent more than 26 years of my career in energy, between electric utilities and natural gas utilities. And what I bring to that is a communications background. So I started my career in journalism, went on to corporate communications and public relations before actually starting the sustainability journey at my company. And I'm closing in on 19 years there now. So it's been really gratifying, and I find that I just love the variety of the work, and I'm really glad to be here. So thanks for the invitation too.
Fantastic. Sustainability is a very critical topic. It's talked about a lot, but we want to start from the very basics. We want to understand from you, Sandra, what is sustainability, and why has it become so important?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I mean, if you look at the formal definition for sustainability, it is, development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the needs of the future to meet their own needs. That's the formal definition. But when I think about sustainability, I think about it as the end goal. It's a journey, right? It's how a company operates in line with ecological limits and social well-being as it meets human needs. I mean, that's the other way of looking at that. But I see it as a journey. And sustainable development is the framework that allows us to manage how we get there, and striking the right balance between the interdependencies between people and the natural world and business. And it's really about striking that right balance. Why is it so important? Well, today I think that we've reached an inflection point where the interdependencies of business, people, and the natural world are at risk of being out of balance. And climate change is the best example of this. We're seeing more severe and more frequent weather events that's devastating to business, people, and communities. Just this past weekend, we saw a massive hurricane barrel through the Caribbean, flattening some islands there. It's now ashore in the United States with life-threatening storm surge. And that also means power outages, which disrupts quality of life and really impacts that. And here in my home state in Ohio, we've had a record number of tornadoes this year. I've lived here for almost 20 years. We had 54 tornadoes that started at like the end of February. That's just insane. So, we're seeing the effects of our inability to balance our coexistence among these dependencies with some pretty devastating outcomes.
So you've just said it. Striking the right balance is what sustainability is about. You've mentioned the climate change and the impact of climate change, and you've just mentioned the power outages that we face today, and that disrupts our life. This is how we are dependent on electricity. So here's my question: how do we connect sustainability with power companies?
Yeah, that's a really, a really great question. The power sector, electric utilities depend very heavily on the ecosystem services that we get from the natural world. For example, in order to generate electricity, we need vast volumes of water to spin those turbines to generate electricity. In most cases, the water is returned to its original body, but it's often warmer than when we took it out, and that impacts local habitats and species. We also rely on the land to mine coal or drill for oil and gas. These impacts have significant impacts on natural resources. Yet, we can't imagine life without electricity. So we have to ask ourselves, can we imagine a world without food and medicine and water if we're having those significant impacts and not striking that balance? Biodiversity, what's really interesting about this is that it really forms the web of life that we depend on for so many things. In fact, biodiversity is seen as one of the solutions for climate change. And yet, we're not valuing it the way that we need to, and protecting it the way that we should. So, at AEP, my company, American Electric Power, we're as much in the construction business as we are in the electric power generation business. We are constantly building new, maintaining old, updating old infrastructure. And it includes, building of wind and solar and transmission lines and towers. And we have to be mindful of the impacts because we have significant impacts when we're doing this work. Um, and so it's finding that balance, and we've done some things. For example, you know because we are so heavily into construction, we look for ways to minimize waste at construction sites. We also look for ways, when you're building a substation or a transmission tower, you need an access road, typically in places where those roads do not exist. And so you're disturbing a lot of habitat, a lot of land, in order to get that access road so you can build that transmission tower, so you can deliver power over longer spans of, from one place to the other. And so one of the things that we're doing is we have these construction ground mats that we're using that protect the ground and don't disturb it as bad when all that heavy equipment has to get across that access road in order to build that transmission tower. So, we're doing things to try to mitigate those impacts, but it's still pretty significant.
Here comes an important question that I ask from everyone who is working on sustainability is what are the three initiatives are being taken by the industry that you work in for sustainability, for a sustainable future?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question because there's some really important work that's going on here. As we make the transition to a cleaner energy economy, we have to be mindful of the impacts that we're having on those energy communities. When I think about, and I'm going to talk about coal because we have coal plants in our portfolio here. And when I think about, retiring a coal plant is typically it's an anchor in a community, and it forms an ecosystem around it. So you've got the direct jobs that are there. You've got the tax benefits that come from having that big infrastructure in that community, but you've also got other indirect and induced economic activity that's occurring, whether it's a supply chain to that plant, or maybe it's restaurants or other service type industries that have sprung up because of the activity around that plant. So as we retire coal plants, we have to be mindful of what those impacts are. So we've adopted a concept called just transition. And really what it's about is that as we make this transition to a cleaner energy economy, that we're not leaving anybody behind. So how do we do that? At AEP, a few years ago, when we were working on our second climate report, I became super interested in just transition, did a lot of research, talked to a lot of people, and came back to the company and said, look, we've already retired like 13,000 megawatts of coal fired generation in the past decade. But going forward, what do you think of this idea of really putting a more human focus on it in terms of the communities that are impacted? We've already had a really good track record and we have a really good model for how we help our employees to make the transition. But we really didn't focus a lot on the community and how do we do that. The first step was to do an economic impact analysis. So we took three of our biggest coal plants and averaged them out and said, what's the impact in general, overall, to a local community? And it's about $160 million a year of direct, indirect, and induced economic activity. And communities often don't realize that that is the real impact. They are looking primarily at the tax revenue that comes in from it, and the jobs, and they don't want to lose people from their communities. Those are very significant impacts. So, those things, when those go away, like the tax revenue, for example, those support public services, and education typically takes the biggest hit. And so, what we do as part of our Just Transition initiative, and we did a pilot at a plant in Texas a couple of years ago. We partnered, and I think the partnerships with other organizations is a really important aspect of this. We partnered with an organization called the Just Transition Fund. They're an NGO. Their sole purpose is to work with coal communities to help them through this transition, to understand what the true impacts are when a coal plant retires and what are their options. And so, by working with the Just Transition Fund, we were able to form a community task force. We had more than 24 community leaders and organizations, from mayors to school superintendents. We had chambers of commerce, we had local economic development organizations, you name it. We had everyone that we could bring to the table at the table to really analyze what will be the impact to these two communities, because it affected two communities. And these two communities would be, I think the impact was around 150 million. So it was pretty spot on with what we had learned from our analysis. And those two communities, they were tiny. So that 150 million in two communities that barely numbered 75,000 people, that's a huge, huge impact to them. And so through this task force and with the help of the Just Transition Fund, we were able to develop a high-level economic diversification plan for them. We did that in about a 6 to 8 month period of time, and then handed it off to an economic development corporation. We come into this work with the very transparent view that when the plant retires, we cannot write a blank check to make up for those tax revenues. That is not sustainable. Our customers cannot afford that. That is not how we can, how we go forward. But we can bring our resources to bear and be a part of that solution, because we're going to be in that community even long after that plant is retired. So what ended up happening in this particular case was they went off after we finished our work, and they reorganized, and now they've got like over 100 organizations and people who are part of this group. And they decided that what they really needed to focus on was workforce development and training. So they went after federal grants and secured about $600,000 in job training grants and another $200,000 to support equipment that they could put in the schools to support those job training programs, because they realized that in order to attract economic development, they needed a skilled workforce that met the needs of the companies and the types of industries that wanted to come there. And so to me, that's a huge, huge initiative. That is, we've been leading on this in our sector for the last few years. We developed a playbook. So we documented everything that we did through this whole pilot program, and so that we can replicate that at other plants. And now we start another plant later this year, also partnering with the Just Transition Fund, which is really exciting. We did all of that, and this year we unveiled new principles, Just Transition principles. These are what we call the non-negotiables as we move from plant to plant. And then we also are developing some metrics. How do we know that we're being successful? We knew we were successful with the workforce aspect of this particular pilot because 90%, more than 90% of the employees found other employment either locally, or they opted to go elsewhere, or they found it within AEP at one of our other companies. And actually, a couple of them went on to work at wind farms. So we know that the skills are transferable, and that was really important to learn as well and be able to document that. So the just transition work, to me, I'm very, very passionate about that because it does have an impact, and it really is people focused. When we talk about climate change, so often we talk about carbon and we talk about the steel in the ground and renewables, but we don't talk about the people aspect. And that's so, so important, and that's what this does. It shines a spotlight on the people. So that's one example of the work that we're doing, that are coming as a result of our sustainability work through the years, and how we're able to make that work. Another example is the focus on environmental justice. So we define that as meaningful engagement with customers and communities, when we're making decisions, about programs, when we're making decisions about where we're going to build something, or maybe decommission something. It's also a commitment to considering the environmental and the social impacts of those decisions. And we're really focused on low wealth communities, marginalized communities, communities of color, tribal communities, populations with language barriers, and populations with differing abilities. So I have one person who's my manager of energy transition, and just transition and environmental and social justice are her two main focuses, because we see those as two sides of the same coin. And we've had some great successes. We put a policy in place about 3 years ago now, and we tested that policy externally as well as internally to make sure we were not using language that was condescending, to make sure that we weren't just talking to ourselves, that we were actually putting something out there that was legitimate and credible, because it had to be credible. And this all came up because, in some of our states, environmental justice was baked into some new laws, some new clean energy laws. And so every time we go before a state regulatory commission, we were being asked, what is your environmental justice policy? What are your practices? And so, and we're also seeing a lot of that coming out of the federal government too, where there are federal grant programs that we're applying to, and they've got an environmental justice component to them. So all of those grant applications, and that's hundreds of millions of dollars that are being applied for, have to come through my organization to check for that environmental and social justice, aspect of those applications. And so that has become really, really integral to our work. And it's something as simple as printing materials in languages that people speak, where we're doing the work. Having translators on site when we're doing an open house for a new project. It's about stakeholder engagement, getting stakeholder perspectives, making sure that we are doing the work and really looking closely at our service territory when we are doing things. When we want to build a new substation or a new transmission line, do we know where it's going? What is the impact? Do those people really, who live in that community, really want to be looking at that? And is there something, if that is indeed the best place for it and where it is most needed, then what can we do to mitigate that for them? So it's really taking into consideration, what their needs are, and really listening. When we started with this work a few years ago, we met with business units and groups across the company, and everyone universally was like, well, we don't have a problem with environmental justice, oh no. But as we had those conversations, people, they started, it was like this light bulb went off, and people were like, oh, now I understand what this is all about. And now people are really embracing it. So we have developed a framework to operationalize it that we're going to start rolling out this year. And it will require all of those business units to develop action plans every single year. And we're not asking them to have these, elaborate plans. We're telling them 1 to 2 goals per year. How are you going to embed and consider environmental and social justice in your work? And then measure that so that we can then go back to regulators and say, look, this is what we're doing, and prove that we are doing that work. But really, the proof is in the impact that we have for our customers and our communities. And that's a really important piece of this too. So, those are a couple of I think, very important examples of some of the work that we're doing. There are other initiatives that are happening, but to me, those are the really most important ones, because we are in the throes of an energy transition, and it's a transition that's happening globally. It's not just here in the United States, for sure. But we have significant impacts to people's lives. And so to me, those, and to AEP, these are really important focus areas for us, because we can have the greatest impact in a very positive way. There's no guarantee, right? I mean, there's no guarantee that everything's going to turn out great and everybody's going to get a job. But we go into it with that mindset, and we go into it with an open mind, and that's really important. And what we're seeing is some of our operating companies, and we have 7 operating companies that operate in 11 states here in the US, and they're coming back to us, and they're doing there's mapping that you can do. There are different tools that we can use to see, okay, are there these types of communities within our service territory? And they're using those tools to better understand who is and where are they located, where are those communities within our jurisdiction. So that's been phenomenal to see it organically grow. We haven't even started to roll out any of the tools yet, but because we have been doing a lot of awareness internally on a constant basis for like the last 3 years, people are really embracing it, and that is just so gratifying to see.
Thank you, Sandra. I'm already in love with this podcast because you've shared some amazing initiatives that you're taking. Um, what you've done is that you've not just uh, shifted to a climate friendly option. You've also involved with the community. Identified their problems and worked around their solution. You have upskilled them into the new ways so that they don't lose their jobs, or even if they lose their jobs, they have some other skills, and they can start doing something else. So that's amazing. But on that note, I have another common question, and that I keep hearing from many people who are, in other industries, and they have to adapt to new ways. Um, there is a feeling that sustainable options are pretty expensive, are costly, I would say, as compared to the old ways of doing. Yeah. So, how would you suggest? I mean, it's an open question. What you'd like to say to these companies who might want to, or may have to, due to some regulatory reasons or some other uh, reasons, or maybe they want to adapt to these new ways, but they have some cost constraints. How would you? How would you? What would be your suggestion to them?
I would say start small with what you can't afford to do. And then you build on that. And what I always tell people, whether it is I'm just starting out in sustainability or I want to do this, you need to build a business case. You need to find advocates within the organization who can support it. And then, once you've got a good advocacy base, and you've got a business case for why you really need to do it, and what the pros and cons, but also what the cost benefits are, and you need to do a cost benefit analysis, then you can bring it forward to management and say, look, here's what we propose, here's why we think we need to do this, here's what it will cost, here's what it will save, and what the overall impact of that is. I always tell people, don't try to boil the ocean. When I first started, it was really about energy efficiency. I mean, it was that simple, getting people that when they left a conference room or their office to shut their lights off. It was that simple. But that led to someone who was in our real estate and workplace services group to really become a champion for how can we operate our facilities more efficiently, and understanding that the upfront capital cost may be more, but the long-term benefit is greater because you're not having to cycle out those equipment that equipment more frequently. It's lasting longer because you put the investment in the upfront. That can be a really hard sell. There's no question about it. And I have run into that myself. And sometimes you just have to put it on the back shelf and move on. It is really tough. And I work in a very highly regulated environment where we can only do what our state utility regulators allow us to do. And if, in some of our states, they're very anti sustainability and anti ESG. And we have to work around that. So we've got to find ways to get the things done that we still want to do. So, for example, we have a net zero carbon goal by 2045. And some of our states, they're coal states, they're oil and gas states, they don't like that. But they understand, too, that in order for us to get the capital that we need from the markets to make the investments in their states for reliable, affordable electricity, we need to have those kinds of goals, because otherwise we can't get the money that we need. We can't get the investments that we need to be able to do that. So, it's a catch-22. It's not an easy fix, but again, start small, find your advocates, build a business case, and take it forward. That would be my advice.
Thank you, Sandra. I'm glad you mentioned start small. You mentioned about turning off lights when you leave a meeting room. These are the small habits that we need to adapt to. Coming back to the power companies, how important is ESG management or sustainability for power companies, and how does it affect their long-term sustainable goals?
It is really important. ESG represents three groups of issues: environmental, social, and governance. And it is particularly important to investors. They use it to screen your non-financial performance. So they want to know that the investments they're making in your company are not being hindered by non-financial performance that they can't necessarily see on the balance sheet because of poor management practices. So it's a risk proxy for investors, basically, so that they can understand how that financial performance is connected to non-financial performance. And it's extremely important. I work very closely with our investor relations team, and we have last year alone more than 30 calls with ESG investors who want to know about different issues. It's not always about climate change either, though that is the number one issue. We've received questions on diversity, equity, and inclusion. We've, received questions on political engagement and lobbying activity, on, workforce safety, particularly during the pandemic. That was extremely important. When there was another utility that got in trouble from a corruption perspective, and investors wanted to know that we had processes and in place that would prevent that from our perspective. So it's really, really important to investors. How does it potentially impact long-term sustainability goals? I actually think it can help them because I have seen through the years that this type of engagement, both with investors and even with NGOs and others, it could be your customers as well, really can inform the decisions you make about the direction your business goes in. And it can impact and influence the goals that you set. For example, it was through engagement that we started setting goals around climate change, particularly around carbon reduction and then greenhouse gas reduction, not just on carbon. It helped us to set energy efficiency goals within our states that allowed our operating companies to then go to states and sell that to the regulators and then be able to implement programs that benefited customers. Also, I've seen it with respect to safety. Safety is a proxy for governance. We had an instance probably about 7 or 8 years ago when there was a dashboard that was pulling publicly available information, but had an algorithm that was really mixing up the safety performance, particularly around fatalities of employees. And what it made it look like to investors who used that dashboard, it made it look like there was something really wrong happening at AP because it had so many employee fatalities, when in fact that wasn't the case. It had taken employee fatalities, contractor fatalities, and public fatalities, which are all very different. I mean, there's still fatalities, but the way that the algorithm was presenting that data are the phone lines within the investor relations organization lit up like a Christmas tree, because investors saw that as a governance issue and a management issue. And there was even one threat of divestiture. That's how serious they take it. So ESG, sustainability, they're two different things in my mind, but they're very interconnected, and they're very important to very specific stakeholder groups. And for ESG, it is really all about the investor. Even though there's been this anti-ESG wave through the U.S., it has not lessened the engagement with investors on those issues, because again, it's a risk proxy for them as they're looking at the holistic view of your company.
Sandra, you've mentioned that investors are now mindful of the non-financial information. So how do you measure sustainable initiatives?
So it really depends on what you're talking about. When you're talking about greenhouse gas emissions, we measure those and report them on an annual basis. We have targets that we're shooting for. So right now, from a greenhouse gas perspective, our target is an 80% reduction by 2030 and net zero by 2045. So that's a pretty straightforward goal that we do measure. Some of it is, a lot of sustainability is not so tangible. And I think about, for example, energy assistance, right? That's another thing that we provide to customers. Like in 2023, we delivered over $110 million in energy assistance to our customers who really needed it. We don't set targets on that, but that's a really important part of how we support our customers and our communities. Philanthropic giving is another way. We don't set targets on those, but in 2023, $31.6 million was, awarded to over 1,700 organizations to advance, basic human needs in our communities, right? So education and those kinds of things. We do measure our environmental performance. We measure our safety performance for sure. We set targets on those things every year. We don't, let me see, trying to think what other things. We measure our reliability performance of our system, so that we know, how it's performing and where potential investments in the future need to be. So there are lots of different ways to measure. We've had goals measuring renewable energy additions to our system. At one point, we wanted to add like 2,000 megawatts. I think now we've got over 11,000 megawatts on our system. So, those metrics and KPIs, they change over time. But some of those things, like especially the climate-related metrics, they do change, but they're always there.
On that point, I wanted to ask you, you've mentioned that AP actually retired coal. What other initiatives the power companies are taking for a more sustainable power generation, I would say, for a bit more sustainable electricity?
Yeah. Clearly, the addition of renewables, so wind and solar in particular, that's really an important way that we're moving in that clean energy transition. That's really, really important. The just transition work is another example of, how we're moving in that direction. And I'm trying to think of what else. The other, one of the greatest challenges we have is that we can only do and go as fast as our state regulators allow us to do, right? So some states like West Virginia Coal is part of their heritage. It drives their economy. They're not going to get out of coal anytime soon. But they are opening the door to more renewable energy in that state. So that's progress, right? So you take the wins where you can get them. And that's, those are the kinds of things that we're doing. Also investments in technology. We have invented a lot of technology on the grid, but we're also testing technology that's being developed by entrepreneurs and other companies. And we use the grid as kind of like a test bed, if you will. Can this work at scale? So if this works with this substation, can it work with every substation? If it works with one power plant, can you scale it up to work on the entire plant? Or the entire fleet of plants. So we have a lot of R&D in our industry, and that's critical to the future and really to achieving that net zero future. I tell people all the time, it's not going to be a straight line from A to B to get there, because technology we thought would be a lot faster and further along than it is today. But it's getting there. It is getting there, but it's not there yet. And so the reality is that we're going to see fossil fuel in the mix for the foreseeable future while technology ramps up and catches up to it. Because the pace of the transition, particularly on the coal retirement front, has gone a lot quicker than anyone anticipated. And the result of that has been concerns about capacity, having enough capacity to serve energy demand, but also the demand is growing. I mean, AI has turned demand on its head, where now we have, historically you would see 1% to 2% growth rates within our sector, and that was pretty normal for like decades. Now we're seeing double digits, and the grid wasn't built to do that. So we're having to infuse more investment, work with regulators at the federal and the state level to expedite that process so we can meet those needs. And it's an exciting time to be in this industry. It's also really challenging, but it's very much an exciting time.
You just mentioned that it's challenging, and you've also mentioned there are anti-sustainability forces. What are the challenges that the power sector is facing while taking sustainable or climate-friendly initiatives?
I think it really boils down to affordability, reliability, and regulatory approvals and or mandates. I really think it comes down to that. We have to do this in a way that everyone can afford and has access to clean energy. We can't invest for a few. We have to invest for all. And so that's one of the big challenges. Now, when you put in renewable energy, you reduce the volatility of fuel cost because you're not paying for fuel. The sun, you're not paying for sun, you're not paying for wind. And so that's helpful to customers in terms of managing their bills. So that is, again, I think it's the regulatory construct in this country that is very challenging. There are some portions of the country and some states that are far ahead on this journey, and there are others where it's going to take some time. And, what we frequently tell our investors is that, look, we're on the right path. We're doing it. It takes time and it takes investment because our customers have to be able to afford it. And whatever we do, we cannot compromise the reliability of the grid. Those are the big challenges. And we've got to, there are competing interests, and sometimes we're caught in the middle of that. And we have to balance that. We've got to find the happy medium in order to get anything done. So, those are big challenges for our sector. And I'm sure other sectors have similar challenges, just in different, maybe different issues. But I think that is, for us, those are the big ones.
What does the future hold?
I'm excited for the future. I think that, we have made such significant progress and change already. And, to think about where technology can take us in the future is really exciting. Keep in mind that many other sectors are relying on the energy sector so that they can decarbonize and they can achieve their goals. So it's really important for this sector to get it right and to get it done. Um, and so I think that we're going to continue along this path. I think that there are always going to be challenges along the way, but we will get there. And that, I have great confidence that we are going to get there and that the commitment is there from the industry perspective to achieve that net zero goal. And to see how that's going to unfold and take shape, it's going to be really super exciting.
Thank you, Sandra. One message you have for the people who are watching this podcast?
Well, first off, I'd say sustainability, as I said at the beginning, is a journey, right? You can't boil the ocean overnight. And so you have to take kind of small bites at the apple to get things done, and then you build on those over time. So I think that's really, one message. And, I think it's really important to have advocates, build, find who those people within your company are who are very passionate about sustainability, and you'll be surprised at just what they bring to the table, and just how many people there are who are passionate about this. And that is particularly true with younger generations. They want to work for companies that are sustainable. They're looking to see what your performance is. What kinds of goals do you have? You want to attract the best and the brightest in talent and be competitive in that space. You've got to have sustainability as one of your core competencies, for your company. So I think it's an exciting time to be in this space. And I'm not talking about any one sector, but to be in sustainability, we get to change the world, and we're leading that. And that's pretty cool.
Thank you very much, Sandra. It was wonderful listening to you. I could feel the passion you have for sustainability. Thank you very much.